Alright, so the next type of loop that we're going to take a look at is going to be the for loop. So essentially what we're going to be doing with this one is taking the individual steps that we've seen with our while loop and do while loop, where we have things like setting up some initial value that we're going to be using to kind of step through the number of times that we will execute that loop. So whenever we want to actually start getting into the body of the loop, we would include some line of code where we would increment that value. So this is what we saw for that initial construction of our loop before we were taking a look at input validation. So we saw something like creating a count, initializing it to 0. We would increment that value. So we used the plus plus operator to increase it by 1 every time we stepped through the loop. And we also included some kind of condition that we were checking for, essentially making sure that it was always less than some upper limit or upper bound. So we're going to take each one of those individual steps and kind of condense those down into just a single piece for our for loop. So this for loop is going to consist of 3 components. They're essentially each one of those different steps that I just described. So we're going to have what is known as the initialization expression, which is used to initialize a variable. The variable is usually going to be the counter that will determine how many times the for loop will execute. This variable can also be declared in this initialization expression. So we could see something like int count equals 0. So we have our full declaration and initialization all within this first portion of our for loop. The next thing that we're going to see is going to be the test expression, which is used to perform our check to determine if the loop should continue being executed. So a common purpose of this check is to determine when the counter has reached a limit, indicating how many times the loop will execute. So that's just like our Boolean expression, our condition that we used in our while loops, or like what we see at the end of a do while loop. And then finally we have the update expression, which is used to modify the value held by the variable from the initialization expression. So a common purpose of this is to increment or decrement that counter. So if we take a look at the general structure of this, so we're going to have the keyword for. We're then going to have the part for our initialization expression, a semicolon, and then the part for our test expression, another semicolon, and then the part for our update expression. So we have all of that contained in the parentheses next to that keyword for. We then have a pair of curly braces, so this will be for the body of our for loop. Inside of that is going to be the set of statements that we're going to execute repeatedly or just kind of run over and over again. Just like a while loop, a for loop is going to be a type of pretest loop. So similar to the while loop, that means that the test expression is going to be checked to be either true or false before we attempt to execute the statements for the very first time. So the general order as far as how we're going to be doing this, when we first get to this for loop, so the first time that our program encounters this, it will see the initialization expression. So we'll go ahead and initialize and also, in this case, declare the variable number that we have right here. It will then go ahead and check that condition. So it'll say, okay, we've got this number, it's initialized to 1. We'll then go ahead and check our condition, number is less than or equal to 10. That is going to be true that very first time. So then we'll go ahead and go into the body of this. We'll go ahead and execute everything that's inside of it. Once we've executed everything that's inside of there, we'll then come over to this update expression where we see number plus plus. We'll go ahead and increment number, and then we'll check that condition again. So again, we'll say, is number still less than or equal to 10? So if we increment it or increase it by 1, that means that number will now hold the value 2. 2 is also still going to be less than or equal to 10. So this condition is still true. So then we'll go back into the body. We'll go ahead and execute that again. And then essentially we're just going to repeat that process, or kind of going in that order of executing the statements in the body, going over to the update expression, checking the condition again, so looking at the test expression, and then going back into the body. So let's go ahead and actually put this together, and I'll kind of do a quick repeat of everything that I was describing there. So go ahead and minimize this. We're going to come over to NetBeans. We'll go ahead and put together a project for this. So we're going to go ahead and create a Java application. Click Next. For this particular one, we'll go ahead and make this our for demo. So we've got our while, do while, and now our for demo. Go ahead and finish. Go ahead and get rid of the extra comments and kind of clean up the style in our Java file. And then right here inside of the main method, we'll go ahead and start putting together the little bit of code that we just showed for that for loop. So we'll go ahead and say for. We've got int count, or number that we used in the example. In this case, I'll go ahead and use count since that's a more common usage of it, or a more common name to give it. So we'll say our int count equal to 0. So we're going to do both the declaration and the initialization in our initialization expression. We then have a semicolon. We're then going to go ahead and include our test expression. So this will be where we put our condition. So in this case, I'm going to say that as long as this count is less than or equal to 10, we'll go ahead and keep running this. And then finally, we'll go ahead and increment this. We'll say count plus plus. And I think if we want to go ahead and capture the same logic as what we have right here, since I start at 1 and do less than or equal, we'll go ahead and start this one at 1 as well. That way then it'll go ahead and execute the same number of times. So then once we've got our initialization, our test, and our update expression, we'll then go ahead and create the body for this. We have that pair of curly braces. And then inside the body here, we're going to go ahead and just put in that one statement. So in this case, we'll just say system.out, that print line. And for now, we'll just go ahead and print the phrase hello world. Go ahead and save this. And so now if I go ahead and run this, I'll again kind of repeat the order that we do things in. The first thing we're going to do, when we first get to line 7, we see all this stuff for our for loop. We'll first just go ahead and come over to our initialization expression. So we're going to go ahead and declare and initialize count. So we've now got this count variable that's initially going to be equal to 1. We then come over to our test expression. So we're going to go ahead and check this to make sure that 1 is less than or equal to 10. This is going to be true. So we will then come into the body of our for loop. So we only have one line of code in the body that we want to go ahead and execute. So we'll go ahead and run this print statement here and print hello world to the console. Once we finish executing all the statements in the body of this for loop, in this case there's just one, then we can go ahead and come over to our update expression. So we'll come over to this. We'll increment the value of count. So we're going to do count plus plus. Now it becomes 2. Now that we have that value of 2, we can come back over to this test expression. So we'll do 2 less than or equal to 10. That's going to be true. So again, we can come into the body and we can go ahead and execute this one statement right here. And from there, we're just going to go ahead and execute this statement. We'll come back over to our update, do another test. If that test comes out true, go back into the body, back to the update, to the test, and just kind of repeat, kind of going in a circle with these 3 parts right here. Once this ends up being false, so that's going to happen whenever our count is incremented to 11. So 11 is not less than or equal to 10. So at that point, we see that this is false. We are not going to execute this. We instead are going to leave the for loop and just come to the next line of code, whatever comes after it here. In this particular case, this is going to be the end of our main method. So that's going to tell us that we want to terminate the program. So the only thing this is going to do is just print out the phrase hello world 10 times. So we'll go ahead and save this and run it. And so we can see right here in the console, we're going to go ahead and print out the phrase hello world 10 times. Okay. So at this point you can kind of see how this is taking the logic of a while loop. So you know that outside the while loop, just before we get into it, we had to declare some variable, our condition for the while loop that makes up this test expression. And then in the body of the while loop, we had to include this update. So we had to include some line somewhere in the body itself that would go ahead and do this or take care of this incrementing process for us. So now we're just going to go ahead and handle all 3 of those parts, so all those different steps for a while loop, all in just this one single line right here in essentially what we would describe as the header for this for loop. So one of the other things to note is with our while, do while, and for loop, if these contain a single line to execute repeatedly, we can go ahead and just omit the curly braces. So they work just like the if, else if, and the else statement, where if we have one line, that very next line that comes after it, if we get rid of the curly braces, that's going to be the line that we execute over and over again. Again, just like I mentioned with if, else if, and else statements, if you choose to omit the curly braces, remember that this is both a blessing and a curse. It does make your code a little bit shorter and a little bit more concise by getting rid of those curly braces, but it can run you into some traps where you might think that by having multiple lines underneath your for loop, that all of those lines will execute over and over again. But because you forgot the curly braces, that's not necessarily going to be the case. So if we take a quick look at this, say maybe right here, I've got both of these statements. Let's say that in addition to printing out this phrase hello world, just before that I want to go ahead and also print out my count. So we've got system.out.println. I want to go ahead and include the count to go with that. So now what it's going to go ahead and do is, in addition to these 10 lines here, we'll get another 10 lines before each one of these. That's going to just count 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 10. So we go ahead and run something like that. And so you can see exactly what I'm talking about right here. So you can see the different lines. We've got 1, then hello world, and 2, then hello world, all the way to the end with 10, and then hello world. So of course in this case, because we're executing multiple lines, you wouldn't be able to do this if you leave the curly braces off. So one of the things you might run into is if you accidentally forget to include these, you do something kind of like this. So this will not do what you think it's supposed to do, and because of the way that I've structured this, because both of these are tabbed over, my IDE and NetBeans is going to warn me about this, saying that I have confusing indentation, again trying to tell me that I've set it up to make it look as if this line is part of my for loop, but it's really not, because I left off the curly braces. So now if I were to run this, it's going to print out the 10 values for count, so the 1 through 10, but it's only going to print hello world once at the very end of all of that, so after I've done everything in the for loop. So if I were to run this, this is my output instead. So if we kind of move this up again, so we can see we've got the values 1 through 10, that's everything from the for loop, but then this hello world is occurring after the for loop is finished executing. So the correct way to do this, if this is what my intent was, would be to do something kind of like this to make it very clear what I intend for this program to do. But in this particular case, what I really want is something like this. Okay. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about our for loop is that the number of times that the for loop executes can actually be specified through user input. Additionally, if you were to use the while loop in a similar manner, you could do this as well. The really convenient thing about the for loop is just the fact that it's more concise and much clearer and cleaner what it is that you intend for it to do. But one of the things that we could go ahead and do is maybe set up a scanner object. So we'll have that read from keyboard input. We've got our scanner keyboard equal to a new scanner object that's reading from system.in. We then go ahead and set up an int variable that we call max value. This will initially be set to 0, but that's just going to be a dummy value since we're going to let the user change that to something else that they would they want to use. So we'll have our print statement, just say please specify how many times to run the loop. We'll go ahead and assign a value to that max value variable based on the user's input. So we're using the next int method from our scanner class. And then inside of the for loop, so if we take a look at the header for this again, so we've got our initialization test and update expression. So our initialization expression will stay the same. We're still going to initialize our number to 1. But then in the test expression, so we've got our number, and we're going to say less than or equal to whatever the max value is. So because of the fact that we're writing it in this way, now whatever value the user gave us, that determines how many times this loop is going to execute. So let's see if we can go ahead and modify our current program to do this as well. So coming over here, so I'll go ahead and leave in both of these statements, just so we can kind of see a little bit of everything that we've covered so far. So we're going to go ahead and include an import statement here. We'll go ahead and bring in the scanner class. We'll say import java.util.scanner. Right here, we'll go ahead and create the scanner object. So we'll say scanner keyboard equal to a new scanner that is reading from the standard input stream, so we'll do system.in. We'll then go ahead and create that int variable, so we can call it max value, so initially equal to 0. Go ahead and adjust our output. Right here, we'll go ahead and put in our print statement with the request to the user, so say system.out.print. Please enter the number of times to execute the for loop. And then right here, we'll go ahead and just take that max value and we will assign to it whatever input the user gives us. So say keyboard.next int. Go ahead and save that. And now right here, instead of doing this 10 times, we're going to do it a number of times equal to whatever max value happens to be. So we'll go ahead and save that. And so now if we go ahead and run this program, so we'll first get this request right here to enter the number of times that we're going to execute this. So let's say we want to do this one just a couple of times, maybe just reduce it down to 3. We'll go ahead and do that. And now we're going to see 1, 2, and 3, and then also the hello world printing out 3 times. So now we can actually control the number of times that this will execute by letting the user decide precisely how many times it'll do that. And of course, one of the other things to keep in mind, this is a good opportunity to demonstrate this. Again, remember that the for loop is a pretest loop. So if you put in something like, say, 0 that initially makes this false, it's not going to do anything. Because it's initially false, it will never execute any of the statements inside of the for loop's body. So with the initialization and update expressions, we can actually include multiple statements inside these. So these multiple statements are going to be specified as comma-separated items in each expression. So to give you an example of this, looking at each one of these different parts, in our initialization expression for this particular for loop, we've got int x equals 1, and we've got a comma, and then y equals 1. So we're going to declare 2 int variables, x and y, and we're going to initialize each one of those to a 1. So x will be equal to 1 and y will be equal to 1. Additionally, if we look over at the update expression, we see we've got x++ and then a comma and then y++. So again, we see we've got 2 different parts, comma separated. With x++, we're going to go ahead and increment the value of x, and then with y++, we're going to go ahead and increment the value of y. For our test expression in this case, we can still only do one thing with that. So we're just going to have one comparison that we're checking for. So in this particular case, we're just going to say, as long as x is less than or equal to 5, we'll go ahead and keep executing this. So let's actually go ahead and take a look at this in NetBeans as well. Go ahead and put together this example. So coming over here. Kind of move down a little bit, and just underneath our previous for loop, we'll go ahead and make another one. So for this one, we're going to say 4. We have int x equal to 1. So this is still what we're pretty used to saying at this point, at least for these first couple of examples. In addition to this, we'll have a comma, and then we're going to say y equals 1. So we're going to include the second initialization for our second variable. We're then going to have the semicolon, so that's going to separate everything that we just put into the initialization expression. Keep all that separate from what we're going to put into our test expression, where we're going to say x less than or equal to 5. We then have another semicolon, and then everything for our update expressions, we'll say x++. We then have a comma again, and then do y++. So with this one, what we're going to go ahead and do is declare 2 variables, x and y. We'll initialize both of these variables to 1. We're then going to have our condition. As long as x is less than or equal to 5, we will continue to execute the statements in our for loop. And then whenever we finish executing those statements, we'll come over to our update expression, and we're going to go ahead and increment both x and y. So x will get increased by 1, and y will get increased by 1. So then, for the body of this for loop, it's only going to be 1 line, so I'm going to go ahead and omit the curly braces for this one. So we're going to go ahead and do a print statement here. Do system.out.println, then a semicolon, and then right here what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to take our x. I'm going to concatenate to that a string literal for a literal plus sign with a space on each side of it. So we're going to have that right there. And then on the right-hand side of this plus, I'm going to go ahead and do another concatenation. We'll concatenate to that the value of y. We'll then go ahead and do another similar sort of string literal for an equal sign. So we're going to go ahead and say essentially x plus y equals, and then we'll go ahead and concatenate on the end of this using parentheses the actual sum of x and y. So again, to make sure that we're doing x plus y the math operation and not just more string concatenation, I'm going to put this part right here inside of parentheses. So that the end result of this is just going to be x plus y equals, and then the actual sum of x plus y. So in this particular case, we're going to start with 1 and 1. That's going to be the very first time that we're executing the statements in the body of this for loop. So we'll do 1 plus 1 equals 2. We'll go ahead and increment both of these. So then the next time around, it's going to be 2 plus 2, which equals 4. We'll then increment them again. So we'll do 3 plus 3, which gives us 6. Then 4 plus 4, which gives us 8. And then finally 5 plus 5, which gives us 10. And then after we increment this once more, x is going to be equal to 6, which is not less than or equal to 5. So at that point, it's false, and it will stop executing. So we'll go ahead and run this. So first, it's going to take me through the upper half of this that we already put together. So I'm just going to put 0 for this one, so we can just kind of ignore any of the outputs from that. Instead, we're just going to focus on lines 21 and 22. So we're going to see all of the statements printing to the console from repeatedly executing line 22. So right here we can see we've got our 1 plus 1 equals 2. So that's the first time that this line, this print statement right here executes. We're then going to do 2 plus 2 equals 4, then 3 plus 3 equals 6, 4 plus 4 equals 8, and finally 5 plus 5 equals 10. So we're going to execute that 5 times for the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Alright, so one last thing to talk about with the for loop. Recall that the block a variable is declared in determines the scope of that variable. So this also applies to for loops, including the variable that you declare in the initialization expression. So in the example that we had before, we declared 2 variables. So we had an x and a y. So because we declared those within the scope of our for loop, that means that they're only going to be usable within the scope of that for loop. So once we are done with this for loop, we move on to the next part of our program. Essentially, those variables are removed, or we just don't care about them anymore. So what that means is that we could actually go ahead and reuse those variable names that we gave them so that we can kind of avoid naming collisions. So if we go ahead and minimize this and take a quick look at what I'm talking about. So we've got this for loop right here that makes use out of this variable called count. So what I'm going to go ahead and do right here is I'm going to modify x to instead be called count. So everywhere where I see an x in this program for these 2 lines, 21 and 22, I'm going to go ahead and replace that with count. So do something like int count equals 1. And then right here we'll go ahead and say count less than or equal to 5. Do count plus plus. And then we're going to go ahead and do count plus y is equal to, and then the actual sum, count plus y. Go ahead and save this. And as of right now, you might already be able to tell, because of the fact that I'm not seeing any errors in my editor, that it doesn't have any problem with me having 2 variables called count, because these 2 variables are in separate and independent scopes. So if I go ahead and run this, again, we're not seeing any problems with it so far. If I go ahead and do something like, say, 3 for this first part, we can go ahead and execute everything in this program, no problems. So we used count right here. We went ahead and declared it and initialized it to 1. We got to use that for this part right here, where we just counted 1, 2, 3, and then printed out hello world 3 times. And then once we were finished with this for loop, so we leave that scope, it basically frees up this variable name, so it's no longer being used. So we could go ahead and reuse it again for something else. So right here, I go ahead and just declare it a second time, and just go ahead and use it in this other for loop so that I can go ahead and execute the print statements to give me 1 plus 1 equals 2, all the way through 5 plus 5 equals 10. So by doing this, our variables are no longer accessible outside of the scope of that for loop, but as we can see, there's a benefit to doing this, which is that we are able to free up and then reuse that same variable name for another declaration. So this is a very useful technique for getting around the issue of naming collisions. Alright, so at this point, this is going to wrap up everything for getting this kind of initial idea about the for loop. In the next video, we're going to take a look at a couple of different use cases, not just for the for loop, but also, again, looking at the while and do while loops. So primarily what we're going to be looking at now is going to be things like running total, so being able to use loops to calculate the total of a set of numbers, or sentinel values, which is going to be another way to essentially function like input validation for being able to determine whether or not we can move on to the next portion of a program. So we'll take a look at that in the next video.